The weight of the serving tray balanced on my left palm had become instinctual after nearly 2 years working at Emilio's, the restaurant tucked in the heart of Belltown, Seattle. It was the kind of muscle memory that allowed my mind to drift quietly while my body moved through each motion with practiced ease. I had learned how to distribute the weight just right, how to keep my wrist locked and my elbow tucked close, exactly as my former manager, Mrs. Helen, had taught me during my first week on the job, when I nearly spilled an entire tray of steaming seafood pasta onto the lap of a businessman in a charcoal suit. The restaurant was always threaded with the smells of garlic butter, fresh oregano, and the warm, earthy scent of bread pulled from the wood-fired oven. Those aromas clung to my hair, to the collar of my shirt, sometimes following me all the way into sleep. I slipped between tables with the fluency of someone who had lived inside this rhythm long enough to stop thinking about it, my worn black flats making almost no sound on the polished wooden floor. The lunch rush had softened into a gentle hum of conversation, the occasional clink of glassware and scattered laughter drifting from the bar. The pale afternoon light of a chilly day filtered through the sidewalk facing windows, casting faint rectangles of gold across the white tablecloths and making the glasses I had polished that morning glimmer more brightly than usual. My back ached, a familiar dull throb after hours of standing, and I was quietly calculating how many more hours until I could lower myself into the tiny porcelain tub in my third-floor studio. Tips today were decent enough to buy groceries for the week, and even spare a little to pay the electricity bill that was nearly a week overdue. "Julia, private room has a special guest. Please make sure everything is perfect." The new manager, Thomas, called from the front desk, his thick framed glasses sliding down his nose from sweat. "The reservation is under Valerio, his executive assistant, but the main guest is a VIP who arrived earlier than expected. He requested absolute privacy. Make everything flawless for me, please." I nodded, wiping my hands on my apron. VIP guests often booked under assistants' names to avoid attention. It was nothing new in a place like Emilio's. I straightened my apron, checked the low bun at the nape of my neck, and carefully lifted the tray of toasted bread, olive oil, and balsamic vinegar, the mandatory ritual Emilio's offered for guests in the private room, and headed toward the thick oak door at the end of the hallway. That room sat completely apart, meant for guests who needed privacy and discretion. I had only been assigned there a handful of times, mostly for closed-door meetings where every word seemed to vanish the second I stepped in to refill water. My left hand stayed steady beneath the tray, while my right hip nudged the heavy door open, my eyes trained on the surface to avoid spilling oil. "Good afternoon, gentlemen. I will be serving you today." The words rose in my throat, but never made it out. There were 5 men seated around the oval table draped in white linen, but I saw only one. He sat at the head of the table, as if the entire room revolved around him. His charcoal jacket hung over the back of his chair, the sleeves of his white shirt rolled neatly up to reveal the forearm I had once touched in the dim light of a hotel room 2 years ago, a night I had tried to bury as if it had never existed. His dark hair was combed back, except for the stubborn strand that always fell over his forehead, exactly as I remembered. He looked older now, a few faint lines around his mouth, a small scar I didn't recall seeing before, and in those storm-gray eyes was something colder, quieter, almost frightening. But it wasn't him who stole the breath from my lungs. Cradled against his chest, held securely in one strong arm, was a baby boy, no more than a year old, perhaps 10 months, with soft curls and gray eyes identical to the man holding him. The child wore a tiny white button-down shirt and little trousers, a perfect miniature of the man himself. Time froze. The baby, who had been shifting restlessly in the man's arms, letting out small, frustrated whimpers, suddenly went still. His storm gray eyes locked onto mine, widening with a focus that felt too intense for such a young child. The fussing stopped instantly. Then, ignoring everyone else at the table, he leaned dangerously far out of his father's protective hold, stretching both chubby arms desperately toward me, a complete stranger. It wasn't a polite gesture. It was a raw, instinctive demand to be held. The sudden silence that swept over the room was heavier than any shout. I nearly dropped the tray. But years of instinct saved me. My grip tightened at the final second, only a thin drizzle of olive oil spilling onto one slice of bread. No one noticed. Every pair of eyes in the room had fixed on me, then on the man holding the child, then on the child still straining toward me, his small hands opening and closing in the air, pleading without a single word. If you're listening to this and something in the story touches a quiet corner inside you, please take a moment to subscribe to our channel, like and share this video, so we can continue bringing you heartfelt stories every day. And if you don't mind, tell me, where are you watching from? Leave a comment below and let us know where in the world this story has traveled to. We cherish every single note you share with us. I set the tray down on the side table near the door, my hands trembling slightly. My palms still warm from the toasted bread, but my spine icy cold as if a draft had slipped through the walls. The baby was still reaching for me, his small body tense with longing. Those gray eyes stayed locked on me with something impossible to name, as if he knew me, as if he remembered. But I couldn't move. I couldn't look away from the man holding him. Daniel Carrington. I didn't need anyone to say his name for me to want to run from the room, but now, with silence settling thick and heavy, I could no longer pretend not to know. Daniel was watching me, his expression unreadable, but his eyes anything but accidental. That was not the gaze of a stranger, nor the polite glance of a customer. In the way he held the child, in the stern lines of his face, there was something that made the air in the room turn dense, as if everyone was holding their breath, waiting for me to speak. But I couldn't. My throat felt scraped dry, my chest drawn tight around a breath that wouldn't come. I heard the baby call out again, this time with a frustrated whimper because the person he called mother wasn't answering. Daniel glanced down, patting the child's back gently, but his eyes never left mine. His hair was still ink black, with just a few strands of silver catching the light leaking from the window. His suit was impeccably tailored, his white shirt crisp, the sleeves rolled high enough to reveal the metallic glint of the silver watch I remembered seeing him clasp on his wrist as he dressed and walked out of a hotel door 2 years ago. He hadn't said goodbye then. Neither had I. We had agreed it was only one night, a brief escape from our separate griefs. Yet here he was now, standing before me, holding a child who called me mother. One of the men at the table, someone who looked like an assistant or a bodyguard, leaned toward Daniel and whispered something. Daniel didn't answer. He only drew the baby closer, shielding him slightly. I saw the boy's face more clearly then, the fair skin, the flushed round cheeks reddened from crying, the strangely determined look in his gray eyes. I didn't need to calculate anything. I knew instantly, down to the marrow of my bones, that the child was mine. But that was impossible, because I had lost my baby. 2 years ago, after the car accident, I spent 5 days in the hospital, and Ethan, my ex-husband, told me the fetus hadn't survived. He had held my hand, his eyes dry, his voice cold, telling me maybe it was for the best. That I shouldn't keep anything born of a mistake, that I wasn't the kind of woman who could be a mother. I believed him. I believed him because I wanted to forget. I wanted to bury everything. But no one can bury a child. I don't remember what I said to end that moment. Maybe an automatic apology. Maybe nothing at all. I only remember backing out of the room, closing the door, and walking straight into the kitchen where the scent of garlic and bread couldn't drown the chaos inside my head. Thomas glanced at me as I passed, but he didn't ask anything. No one did. Only the small gray eyes remained in my mind, along with the echo of that word, Mama, piercing clean through the armor I had built around myself all these years. That baby was mine, and Daniel Carrington was holding him as if it were the most natural thing in the world. I stood frozen over the sink in the back kitchen, my palms pressed against the cold stainless steel edge, trying to keep myself from collapsing. My breathing came fast and shallow, not from exhaustion, but from the way my mind felt ripped open by a rush of memories exploding all at once. The image of that baby reaching for me still burned in my mind, looping like a broken tape I couldn't shut off. I closed my eyes, but instead of darkness, all I could see was his gray gaze, the desperate way he had leaned toward me, those small hands grasping at the air between us like an accusation made of flesh and breath. He hadn't made a sound, but his need had screamed louder than words. The scent of roasted garlic and tomato sauce no longer smelled like food. It clung to my chest like a heavy fog I couldn't breathe through. I swallowed hard, trying to force down the rise of nausea. In my mind was Ethan's face, that frozen smile the morning I woke after the accident, his expression devoid of anything human when he told me our child hadn't survived. I hadn't been clear-headed enough to question him, too broken body and soul to demand answers. Ethan had taken advantage of that moment to bury every trace of the truth. Now I understood why, whenever I asked to see my medical records, he always deflected. Why there was never a death certificate, never any formal medical paperwork, only his word, because maybe the baby had never died at all. I grabbed a paper towel to dry my hands, then braced them against the sink again. Outside, the voices of diners drifted back into the air, distant and muffled, as if I were hearing everything from underwater. I had to get out. I needed air. I slipped out the back door into the small concrete lot behind the restaurant, where industrial dumpsters sat beside a few potted plants shriveled by the cold. Seattle's sky was blanketed in pale gray, and the air carried the scent of last night's rain. I leaned against the brick wall, my arms wrapping around my stomach out of an instinct I thought I had long buried, the instinct of a mother who once believed she lost her child. But if I never lost my child, if the grief I had mourned for so long was nothing more than a carefully constructed lie, and if that baby truly was mine, why was he in Daniel Carrington's arms? I had never told Daniel I was pregnant. We had only shared a single night, one I had spent years trying to convince myself was a mistake, a moment of weakness. After that, I returned to Ethan, to a marriage that was already rotting at its core. It ended as if it had never existed. I never stayed in touch with Daniel, never learned anything about him beyond his name and the hotel keycard attached to the hurried thank you note he'd left behind. I remembered the hollow ache when Ethan told me the pregnancy hadn't survived, remembered the way he held me, comforting me like a loving husband, while something cold and soulless lingered beneath his touch. I remembered the nightmares that came for weeks after, the emptiness that gnawed at me no matter how I tried to numb it. I blamed myself, convinced it was punishment for my betrayal. But now, if that child was truly mine, if Daniel had been raising him for nearly a year, then everything I believed collapsed like a fragile shell. A hand rested lightly on my shoulder, making me spin around. It was Thomas, the manager, his eyes filled with concern. "Julia, are you all right? Do you need to go home? I can assign someone else to that table." I shook my head, trying to force a smile, though I must have looked far worse than I imagined. "I'm fine. Just a little dizzy." He nodded softly and stepped back, giving me space. I exhaled and stared up at the sky, gray and empty. I had to face this. I couldn't run, not this time. I walked back into the restaurant, washing my hands carefully, smoothing my hair, then returning to the bar to grab a glass of water, my mind spinning with 1,000 questions while my steps stayed steady. When I approached the private room, Daniel was already waiting outside the door. His expression was no longer cold. His voice, when he spoke, was low and rough, as if he had weighed every word before letting it go. "We need to talk." For a long moment, I simply looked at him, unable to reply. Then I nodded. Not because I was ready, but because I knew I had no other choice. I needed answers. I needed to know who that child was, and why he called me mother. We sat across from each other in a small cafe tucked behind the restaurant, the warm yellow lights glowing against old brick walls as if trying to soften the tension strung tight between us. Daniel ordered an espresso, while I asked only for a glass of water, my hands still trembling against the dark wooden table. Neither of us spoke for the first few minutes. I looked at him, trying to keep my eyes steady, but it was difficult when his face pulled forth every detail of the night I had tried to forget for 2 years. He watched me too. His eyes no longer cold but filled with something layered: caution, curiosity, and perhaps a buried recognition, as though he too was trying to piece together a memory shattered by time. In the end, I was the one who spoke first. "Do you remember me?" Daniel didn't answer right away. He took a sip of coffee, set the cup down, and then nodded. "Yes. Hard to forget a night like that." His voice was quiet, but his eyes didn't leave mine. It wasn't flirtation or nostalgia, it was truth. And I knew it. That night was one of the few times in my life I had let everything go. Logic, dignity, the very reasons I kept going. I had run from Ethan in the middle of the night after a vicious argument that left me drained, realizing I had nothing left to fight for in a marriage that had become a hollow shell. I wandered through the rain, my coat too thin, tears mixing with raindrops until I couldn't tell which was which. And then I walked into the hotel bar like someone lost without a map. Daniel sat alone, nursing a glass of whiskey, staring into nothing. We didn't talk much. In truth, we barely spoke at all. A look, a silent understanding. Two strangers, both cracked open, finding each other in a moment when there was nothing left to lose. When he led me upstairs and his hand brushed the small of my back, I didn't pull away. Not because I loved him, but because I needed to feel seen, to believe I was still someone who could be touched, desired, held gently. The room had smelled of wood and hotel soap, the amber bedside light casting everything in a soft haze. There had been no rush, no promises, just two bodies trying to soothe the pain in each other. I woke first the next morning, wrapped in the white hotel sheets. He was still asleep, and without the tension in his brow, he looked younger. I thought about leaving a note, but I didn't. I walked out as quietly as I had walked in, believing it was the best for both of us. We owed each other nothing. There was no future after a night like that. But weeks later, when I discovered I was pregnant, I nearly collapsed. I couldn't tell Ethan, and I couldn't reach Daniel. I knew nothing about him beyond his name and a room number scribbled on a card. I wanted to keep the baby. For a brief moment, it felt like the only thing left in my life untouched by pain. Then the accident happened. A car slammed into me only 3 blocks from home. I woke in the hospital, my head bandaged, my stomach burning with pain. Ethan sat beside me, holding my hand, telling me the baby hadn't survived. I couldn't react. I couldn't ask. I believed him. I thought maybe it was the price I had to pay. Now, with Daniel sitting in front of me and that child calling me mother, the fragments of memory shifted in my mind like something awakening after a long sleep. Daniel spoke softly, as though reading the thoughts unraveling inside me. "I didn't know you were his mother. I didn't know anything. I only knew this baby was my son." They told me the surrogate died after giving birth. They never gave me a name. Everything went through lawyers and an agency. I stared at him. We were lied to. Both of us. He nodded, and something that looked like pain flickered in his gray eyes. Then we find the truth, I said. There was no doubt now. That night had never been a mistake. It had been the beginning of everything. I left the cafe when dusk had already swallowed the sky, unable to remember what I'd said to Daniel to end our conversation. It might have been a nod, a strained thank you, or perhaps nothing at all. I walked along the damp cobblestone streets of Seattle, each footstep echoing in my mind like a knock on the door of an old memory. With every step, I found myself drifting back to that fateful day in the hospital, when I opened my eyes to blinding white lights, the sharp scent of antiseptic filling the air, and Ethan sitting beside me with a face carved out of stone. He didn't cry, didn't rage, didn't hold my hand the way a grieving father might. He spoke in a flat tone, as if reciting lines he had memorized. "You lost the baby. The pregnancy didn't make it. The doctor said it's a miracle you survived." I remembered staring at him for a long time, searching for even a flicker of sorrow in the man I had once loved. But all I saw was emptiness. I wanted to ask why. I wanted to scream. But my body was too weak to lift itself from the bed, so all I could do was turn my face toward the wall and let quiet tears soak into the pillow. In the days that followed, Ethan cared for me like a devoted husband. He cooked porridge, brought me medicine, read to me as though making amends for a loss he himself had orchestrated. When I asked for medical documents, he told me the doctor would send them later. When I asked for the final ultrasound image, he said the machine malfunctioned and hadn't saved it. When I said I wanted a small service, even just a symbolic goodbye for the child I would never meet, he called it unnecessary. "You need to move on, Julia. Don't punish yourself." He repeated it so many times that I began to believe him. I tried to believe him. Until now, when that baby appeared warm, breathing, alive, calling me mother and looking at me with eyes that mirrored my own memories, the pieces I had buried began to surface like fragments of a long-drowned nightmare. The pain I felt back then hadn't been the grief of someone who had lost a child. It had been the grief of someone robbed. I hadn't lost my baby. My baby had been taken. The thought twisted my stomach, nausea rising up my throat. I walked straight home to my small apartment, the one I rented after the divorce, on the third floor of a worn-down building with a rattling elevator and hallways that always smelled of spicy food. I locked the door, switched on every light as if brightness could chase away the darkness settling inside me. I pulled out the wooden box from under my bed, the place where I'd hidden every remnant of that brief pregnancy. A blurry ultrasound print, a blood test receipt, a small slip of paper with a doctor's appointment I once forgot to bring. None of it was definitive proof, but every piece confirmed one truth. I had been pregnant. I had felt that life flutter inside me. I had rested my palms on my belly and whispered soft promises I no longer dared to remember. And then, in a single night, it had all vanished, replaced with silence and the words of a man I thought I knew. I picked up my phone and dialed the hospital, but they told me the records had been transferred at the request of next of kin. Next of kin. Ethan. I hung up and sank onto the edge of my bed, hollowed out. Now I finally understood. He hadn't just lied. He had orchestrated everything. But why? To control me? To punish me? Or for money? In that moment, something inside me shifted. I was no longer a victim. I was a mother, and I would fight to reclaim my child. Even if it meant digging through every decaying layer of my past, even if the man standing in my way was the one who once slept beside me each night. I would not back down. Not this time. I didn't sleep at all that night. staring at the ceiling as unanswered questions spiraled through my mind. The ticking clock felt like a blade scraping my nerves, each second a countdown to the moment I would have to confront the truth. I couldn't keep living in vague memories and the lingering sting of betrayal. I needed proof. Something concrete to force the truth into the light. And then, just as dawn edged along the window, my phone rang. It was Daniel. His voice was low but steady, without preamble or hesitation. He wanted to meet. That same day. At a private clinic he had already arranged. I barely hesitated. I arrived 15 minutes early, my heart drumming as I stared at the words, Evergreen Diagnostics, printed on the glass door. Everything inside was spotless, modern, and oppressively quiet, the kind of place accustomed to keeping secrets buried. Daniel was already waiting in the lobby, wearing a navy sweater over a white shirt, his hair neatly combed, his eyes tight with tension when they met mine. Beside him sat a fair-haired woman wearing glasses and a white lab coat, Dr. Marin, who would oversee the testing process. I sat across from them, trying to appear calm though my hands were cold and clasped tight in my lap. Daniel spoke first, without pleasantries. He knew this came with risks. He wouldn't pressure me, but he needed the truth, and so did I. He explained that when the baby was delivered to him under the surrogacy contract, there had been little information. Everything had been handled by lawyers, and the surrogate's identity was sealed by the agency. He had never imagined it could be me. I nodded, unsure of what to say. All I could do was agree to the test. We completed the procedures in silence. Dr. Marin collected cheek swabs from both Daniel and me, then sealed the vial containing the baby's sample, the one Daniel had submitted the day before. It all happened quickly, yet to me it felt endless. When it was over, Daniel walked me to his SUV parked behind the building, its windows darkened for privacy. He didn't speak until we were both inside, the only sound the faint whistle of wind through the door. Finally, he spoke, his voice rough. If the results are what we think they are, it means both of us were deceived. I turned to him. In his eyes, I saw something I never expected: fear. A quiet, unfamiliar unease settling beneath his usual control. I knew Daniel was not a simple man. He didn't have to say it for me to understand that he lived in a world with shadows and sharp edges where power blurred with danger. But in this moment, we were not two strangers from separate worlds. We were two people who had been stripped of the truth, trying to gather the scattered pieces of a story neither of us had agreed to. Daniel admitted he had questioned parts of the adoption process, but everything had seemed perfect. The baby looked so much like him that no one thought to ask questions. But when he reached for you with that kind of certainty, like he knew you, like he belonged to you, every assurance I had clung to collapsed. I stared out the window at the trees shedding their last leaves into the cold wind. Neither of us said it aloud, but we both understood that if the results confirmed our fears, this was no longer just my story or his. It was the story of a child stolen, and of two adults carefully deceived. And someone somewhere would have to answer for it. That night I sat alone in my apartment, the glow from the floor lamp stretching long orange shadows across the floor, but none of that warmth reached me. I held an old photo in my hands, a picture of Ethan and me standing in front of the first house we rented in Tacoma, both smiling, though now I saw only a woman clinging desperately to something already broken. I remembered the morning I discovered I was pregnant, an early spring day when I'd been sick in the bathroom without knowing why. Ethan took me to the drugstore and waited in the car, impatient as always. I didn't check the test until we were home, sitting on the edge of the bathtub when two red lines appeared, bold and undeniable. I dropped to the floor, hands on my stomach, sobbing not from fear but from something sacred blooming inside me. Even though that pregnancy had come from a mistake, in that moment all I knew was that I carried a life within me, a part of something real, but that joy had been crushed almost immediately by reality. When I told Ethan, he froze for a moment, then turned away. He didn't ask how I felt, didn't hold me, didn't say a single tender word. Only one curt question. "Are you sure?" I nodded, and his next sentence sliced through me. "So what are you going to do?" I didn't know how to answer. I wanted to keep the baby, but I knew Ethan didn't. The weeks that followed were a slow suffocation. He became colder, quicker to anger, gone for long stretches, coming home reeking of alcohol and unfamiliar perfume. I lived in a constant state of tension, trying to work, trying to protect the fragile life inside me, while Ethan chipped away at my hope piece by piece. When I mentioned doctor's appointments, he brushed them off. When I went alone, he said it was wasteful. When I bought a few tiny baby items, he told me not to be impulsive, that pregnancies often didn't last. He was starving my hope slowly, methodically. Still, I kept telling myself he would come around. I was wrong. One night, after I'd fallen asleep on the couch just to escape his criticism, he sat beside me and spoke gently, so gently I should have known it was a lie. He said I needed to be realistic, that a baby would ruin our future, that I wasn't capable of being a mother, that I was clinging to a mistake because I didn't want to admit our marriage was already dead. I looked into his eyes, and for the first time I saw a stranger. A man willing to remove anything that didn't fit his plans. I held my stomach, whispering apologies to the child inside me, promising no one would hurt him. I never imagined danger would arrive so quickly. The accident happened on a cold, rainy morning. I remembered the glare of headlights, the shriek of brakes, then darkness. When I woke in the hospital, Ethan was there, and the first words he said were, "You lost it." No pain in his voice, no grief, nothing real. I believed him. I thought it was fate. But now, as everything falls apart around me like a painting glazed to hide cracks beneath the surface, I finally understand. Ethan didn't just not want the baby. He planned to get rid of him. And if the child Daniel is raising is truly mine, then someone helped Ethan carry out that plan. I don't know who stood behind him, whose hands touched my life from the shadows, but I know one thing with absolute clarity. I will not stay silent. Because now I am not just a woman who was betrayed. I am a mother fighting for the child she never once let go. Daniel sat alone in his office on the top floor of Carrington Holdings, the glass wall overlooking Seattle's skyline blurred beneath a thick veil of fog. But today, nothing outside the window could distract him more than the documents spread across his desk. Files, contracts, printed emails from the past year, all arranged in careful rows, marked with small yellow tabs, annotated in his sharp, precise handwriting. He was never just a businessman. In Daniel Carrington's world, anything unclear had a reason, and this time he refused to let instinct be smothered by the truth, slowly peeling back layer by layer. After Julia left last night, he hadn't slept. The way Mason had stopped crying the instant she appeared, the way he had reached for her with such desperate familiarity, those moments shattered every assumption he had built his life upon. Mason was terrified of strangers. He never went to anyone he didn't know. Yet with her, it was as if he had found something he had been missing. The child he loved, protected, and raised as if he were his own blood might not only be his son through an anonymous surrogacy contract, he might also be the flesh and blood of the woman he had shared only one night with, and perhaps it had never been coincidence at all. He began where he had to. The agency that arranged everything from the moment he had signed the contract, Horizon Family Solutions, headquartered in California, but operating nationwide. All communication had once gone through his attorney, every step seemingly clean, every payment legitimate. But the deeper he dug, the more wrong it all felt. The woman listed as the surrogate, Jessica Lane, was noted as having died due to complications after delivery. No photograph, no death certificate, no relatives. Just a name inside a file. Daniel hired his own legal team to investigate. There was no Jessica Lane living at the listed address. No medical records, no insurance file, nothing. The name might never have existed. His pulse pounded at his temples when the investigator's report arrived the next morning, confirming every instinct he had tried to push aside. Horizon Family Solutions had once been accused of embryo misplacement 3 years prior, but thanks to legal loopholes and a settlement, the case vanished and the company carried on. No one looked too closely. People using services like these often paid handsomely to ensure silence. Daniel contacted Richard, his longtime legal advisor, instructing him to uncover whoever was behind the company. The name that surfaced was Martin Dales, a discreet businessman and former shareholder of a private hospital chain. Martin had indirect ties to Ethan Rowe, Julia's ex-husband. Financial records showed a suspicious transfer from Ethan's company to an investment fund linked to Horizon made during the exact period Julia had been pregnant. When Daniel saw it, his hand curled into a fist. The pieces no longer resembled speculation. Ethan had been involved, perhaps even the mastermind behind the falsified surrogate identity. Julia might have been deceived before she even knew what had happened. And if that were true, Daniel had been deceived as well. He looked toward the framed photo on his desk, Mason sitting in the grass, smiling wide with a toy car clutched in his hand. This boy had never been part of any plan, but once he entered Daniel's life, Daniel could no longer imagine a world without him. And now, with the truth hinting at a network of stolen infants buried beneath legal paperwork, Daniel realized he was no longer simply a father. He was the only man capable of bringing the truth to light. He dialed Julia. His voice was low, steady. "We have a bigger problem than we thought. I need you to meet me. And this time, not just to learn the truth, but to confront it." We met again that late afternoon in a private law office tucked high above the city. Julia walked in with a calmness that surprised me, though I knew turmoil churned beneath the surface. She took a seat opposite me at the long, dark wood conference table, her hands clasped tightly in front of her. I opened my laptop and showed her everything I had found, every financial transaction, every contract page, every shadowy document pulled from a system carefully disguised as legitimate. When she saw Ethan's name appear on a bank statement, her eyes darkened. It was a transfer made almost exactly when she had her accident, a payment from Ethan's company to a financial intermediary tied back to Horizon Family Solutions. Julia didn't speak for several minutes. She only stared at the screen, then abruptly stood, walking to the window with a hand pressed to her chest. I stepped beside her and rested a hand on her shoulder. She nodded faintly, not looking at me, her voice barely above a whisper. I knew he was cruel, but I didn't think he was capable of this. I squeezed her shoulder gently, then returned to the table and continued laying out the truth. Horizon wasn't merely a surrogacy agency. Through layers of shell companies and fabricated accounts, they had built a sophisticated network that swapped identities, forged maternal records, and controlled entire medical files. The real mothers were erased from the system, replaced with invented profiles like Jessica Lane. They manufactured false death reports, told families the baby hadn't survived, then funneled the newborn into a legal surrogacy contract selling children to wealthy clients for hundreds of thousands of dollars. I found at least 3 other cases, all processed through the same law firm, the same insurance company, all disappearing from medical databases overnight. Julia returned to the table, her expression no longer panicked but cold with clarity. I used to think the accident was fate, but now I know it was arranged. He knew I would keep the baby. He knew I would never give it up. And that accident wasn't an accident. I nodded, my hand tightening into a fist. We are facing a child trafficking ring disguised as a legitimate surrogacy network. And Ethan? He's not just an accomplice, he might be the architect. Julia sank into her chair, her face pale but her eyes blazing with resolve. I don't care whose reputation gets destroyed. I don't care how many people get dragged into the light. I just want Mason to have the truth he deserves. I looked at her, and in that moment, I no longer saw a woman once crushed by grief. I saw a mother ready to burn the world if it meant saving her child. I opened the final file, a set of leaked internal emails from Horizon. One message mentioned a regional coordinator overseeing newborn transfers in the Pacific Northwest signed with the initials ER. Julia stared at those letters, her hands trembling visibly. Ethan Rowe. It could be no one else. I closed the laptop and looked straight into her eyes. Now we have enough to begin. But to end this, we need him to confess. And that won't be easy. Julia tilted her head slightly, her lips pressed into a hard line. Then let me be the one to drag the truth out of him. For Mason. And for myself. The white envelope lay neatly on the dark wooden table, the logo of Evergreen Diagnostics embossed faintly in the corner. Neither of us touched it at first. Julia sat perfectly still, her eyes fixed on the edge of the envelope, as if whatever waited inside could slice open the fragile world she was struggling to hold together. I stood by the window with my hands in my pockets, watching the slow river of cars moving down the street below. Every second in that room stretched like an endless winter. At last, Julia reached forward, her fingers trembling but determined. She tore the envelope open and slid the papers out, her gaze scanning each line, each symbol. I stepped beside her without a word, waiting for the shift in her breathing. And then it came a long, quiet exhale, not of despair but of something finally confirmed after too many sleepless nights. She handed me the results, her index finger resting on the bold sentence near the bottom of the page. Probability of biological relationship between sample 01, Julia Rowe, and sample 03, Mason Carrington, is 99.99%. Conclusion: mother and child. I let the words settle slowly in my mind, like a seal pressed into stone. There was no doubt now. The boy was her child. The boy was our truth. Julia covered her face with both hands. She didn't cry, but her whole body seemed to fold in on itself. I knelt beside her, placing a hand on her knee, my voice rough. Now you know. There's nothing left to question. She didn't look at me, only nodded, her shoulders trembling. I didn't try to pull her close or fill the room with reassurances. We allowed the silence to settle around us. A small ritual for burying every doubt and every illusion we had once forced ourselves to believe. When she finally lifted her head, her eyes were different. No longer the eyes of a woman swept into something too large to grasp, but the eyes of a mother who knows exactly what she is fighting for. I want to see my son, but not as a stranger stopping by for a few minutes. I want him to know who I am. I want Mason to have the truth in the gentlest, safest way possible. I nodded. We'll do it your way. And no one comes near you or him without your permission. Julia took my hand, her first time reaching for me. The gesture wasn't firm, but enough to tell me that beneath all the loss and all the wounds, something alive was slowly beginning to grow. I rose and walked to the desk, opening a drawer and taking out a small box. Inside was the newborn bracelet the nurse gave me the day Mason was born, a pale blue band with his name written in black ink, Mason C. I placed it in her palm. Her fingers shook as they touched it, as though she were brushing against the very moment her child had been stolen from her. She looked at me, her voice steady though her eyes blurred with tears. Now we start with him. He needs to feel that everything I lost was real, and that everything he has now is real too. I squeezed her hand again. There was no turning back, no doubts left. We had the truth, the evidence, And one reason stronger than anything else, an innocent child dragged into a filthy web of power and deceit. And we were the ones who would end it. From that moment on, this wasn't only a search for a stolen child, it was a fight to restore dignity, identity, and the love that a broken system had tried so hard to bury. I drove Julia home that afternoon through the cold Seattle air, the sky smothered in gray clouds like a curtain refusing to fully lift after a long night. She sat in the passenger seat clutching the newborn bracelet, as if it were the only thread connecting her to the child she had never been allowed to hold as a mother. When I glanced at her, I saw her staring out the window, not panicked anymore, not even visibly hurting the way she had been, but held together by a quiet mixture of steadiness and guardedness. When we pulled up to Carrington Plaza, I didn't turn off the engine right away. She looked at me, her brows drawing together slightly, waiting for the words I hadn't yet said. "Julia," I began slowly, "this is not a suggestion, it's something I need to tell you. You and Mason need protection. There will be eyes on us now, and Ethan will not sit still while we uncover what he worked so hard to hide." I turned toward her, my voice firm. "I want you and Mason in the penthouse, at least until this comes to light." Julia stayed quiet, not surprised, but I caught the flicker of caution behind her eyes. "I don't need pity. I don't need a place to hide." I shook my head. "This isn't hiding, it's defense. It's protecting your son, and protecting you from a man who staged an entire illusion to take your child without a second thought. Where you live now has no cameras, no security, and I can't sleep at night knowing you're there alone." She stared at me long enough that I almost expected her to refuse, but then she exhaled and nodded. "I'll go, but only temporarily. I still need time to understand what this is and what we are." I nodded. "I'm not rushing you. What matters now is that you and Mason are safe, together, and not afraid to walk out the door." I called the building manager and instructed him to prepare the penthouse on the 32nd floor, the place I used when I needed distance from the world. It had 3 bedrooms, a large kitchen, a terrace overlooking the bay, and, more importantly, private elevators and 24-hour security. When we stepped inside, Julia paused at the doorway. The late afternoon light cast soft shadows across her face, revealing the faint bruised circles beneath her eyes. I said nothing, simply stood behind her, letting her feel that this place was here for her, not out of sympathy, but because she deserved the safety she had been denied. She moved deeper into the room, her fingertips brushing the back of the sofa, the smooth surface of the table, the edges of drawers, confirming the space with a quiet, solemn reverence. "Will Mason be okay knowing I'm his mother?" Her voice was soft but clear. I stepped beside her. "No child forgets the warmth of the woman who carried him. Even if you say nothing, he will know. Even if you hide, he will find you." Julia turned to me, her eyes shining with something fragile yet undeniably real. "I'm afraid. Afraid he'll hold me and then let go. Afraid I'll love him and lose him again." I took her hand, gently, her fingers cold but steady. "You're not alone. Not this time." She nodded slowly and walked toward the bedroom prepared for her and Mason. She didn't ask another question. The door closed behind her, and I stood in the quiet living room, watching her silhouette disappear into the dim light. And I knew, from that moment, this place was no longer just my penthouse. It was becoming a home. A place where what had been broken might begin to live again. The first morning Julia and Mason woke in the penthouse was strangely peaceful. Soft sunlight seeped through the sheer curtains, falling across the little boy's sleeping face. Julia sat watching him, each rise and fall of his breath like a bell ringing gently inside her chest, soothing her, steadying her, yet stirring a deeper fear. She knew this calm wouldn't last. The storm waited outside the door, and it arrived sooner than she expected. I was in my office when my assistant entered, pale, handing me an unmarked envelope. Inside was a single printed image from the building's internal security system, one no one else should have had access to. Julia walking into the diagnostics lab beside me, holding the DNA documents. A slip of paper was attached, scrawled in uneven black ink. If you don't want Carrington dragged into a national scandal, keep the girl and the results to yourself. I'll call. I crushed the paper in my fist, rage burning through me. Ethan Rowe. He had finally shown his hand. No lawyers, no emails. Just a threat. Raw and personal. He called that night. Julia was on the floor with Mason, helping him with building blocks, though her eyes flicked toward the door now and then. I stepped onto the balcony and shut the sliding door before answering. His voice came immediately, dripping with venom. You think you're smart, Daniel? You think exposing me makes you a hero? One accusation from me and you're finished. The press will tear you apart. Your stock will crash. Your whole pathetic empire will be gone in a week. I stayed silent and let him spit poison. Then he went on, his tone sharpening. You want to keep the woman and the kid? Fine. 20 million. Cayman account. Friday. You pay, I disappear. You keep your little family and your reputation. Cheap price for a secret, isn't it? I stared at the lights of the city below, cars streaking like thin rivers of fire. But all I saw in my mind was Julia holding Mason, her hands trembling with love she had barely begun to allow herself to feel. My voice dropped to steel. I don't bargain with garbage. You touch them again, and I won't need a courtroom. I'll bury you myself. Ethan's bitter laugh cut off as he hung up. I stood there a moment, breathing deeply, forcing down the fury clawing its way up my throat. When I returned to the living room, Julia looked up at me, her eyes full of questions she didn't yet speak. I sat beside her, resting a hand lightly on the back of her chair. Ethan contacted me. He knows about the DNA, and he's trying to buy silence. She stiffened, blinking rapidly before letting out a long breath. I knew he wouldn't let this go, but I didn't think he'd go after you too. I took her hand in mine. This isn't just your story anymore, Julia. He picked the wrong man to threaten. I won't let him get near you again. She nodded, gripping my hand with sudden strength. And in her eyes I saw something new, not fear, but resolve. We both understood. The battle had begun, and Ethan would not walk away from it without losing everything. I couldn't let Ethan vanish before the truth was exposed. I couldn't allow him to keep tightening his grip on Julia's life, on Mason's life, or on anyone else who had ever fallen victim to the web of lies he helped build. I had once told him I wouldn't need a courtroom to deal with him, and I kept my word. 3 days after his extortion call, when Ethan stepped out of a luxury hotel in Bellevue, 2 men in black suits approached him, quiet, discreet, and a black SUV eased up beside them, its door swinging open before he was pushed inside. I waited in a soundproof room beneath one of my company's properties, a place without cameras or any device that could be traced. When Ethan was shoved into the chair, his hands bound behind him with padded restraints, his face turned ashen the moment he saw me. You can't do this, Daniel. I'll sue you. I cut him off. My tone is steady as if we were discussing a merger. You have 3 choices, Ethan. 1. Tell me everything I need to know and disappear from this country forever. 2. I take every piece of evidence I have, every document, every transfer, every connection you have to the infant trafficking ring and hand it to the press, the FBI, and anyone else who can burn your life to the ground. 3. I do nothing at all. 1 leaked bank statement and you'll be floating in a river before you can shout for help. Choose. He thrashed, rage flickering in his bloodshot eyes, but I could see fear leaking through the cracks in his bravado. You don't understand, Daniel. I was just a small part of this. I didn't think it would go this far. I just needed the money. Julia wanted to keep the baby. She wouldn't listen to me. I lost control. I leaned forward, staring straight into him. What did you do, Ethan? Spell it out. He swallowed hard, then spilled everything, not out of remorse, but because it was the only way left for him to breathe. He told me how he contacted Martin Dales, the man behind Horizon, to arrange the identity switch. How, when he learned Julia was pregnant and determined to keep the baby, he built a false profile labeling her as a surrogate for an anonymous client. How he arranged the accident, hiring people to stage the scene, manipulate hospital records, and move Julia into a medical facility affiliated with Horizon. By the time she woke up, every detail had been altered. The real baby marked as lost. The living child transferred into my contract. I didn't know it was your kid, Ethan stammered. I thought it was just a transaction money for silence. I didn't know you were involved. I said nothing as I stood, looking at him the way one looks at something no longer human. I have copies of every financial transfer, every email, and your confession is already recorded. I have witnesses. I have data. I have confirmation from Horizon itself. I don't need you to bring this to light. But if you cooperate, I'll give you a way to stay alive. I won't kill you, but I will make sure you spend the rest of your life as a ghost. His head dropped, defeat hollowing him out. I dialed Richard. Get him out of the city tonight. Arrange it so he never comes back. When I returned to the penthouse, Julia was sitting beside Mason, reading him a picture book. She looked up when I stepped inside. I gave a single nod. It's done. She nodded back, her eyes glistening not with pain this time, but with the fragile relief of someone who knows the nightmare has finally ended. The information Ethan had given us didn't merely confirm our suspicions, it opened the door to a labyrinth far darker than anything I had imagined. The financial trails, the backdoor transactions, the contracts that pretended to legitimize the process, all of it revealed a machine built on human trafficking, lubricated by loopholes and money. At the center of it all was Martin Dales, a man once investigated for corruption in the private hospitals he owned, a man who had never been convicted. He knew exactly how to slip through cracks, bribe the right people, burn the right documents, and maintain an immaculate facade. Horizon Family Solutions was just one mask among many, one node in a system that rotated newborns from women who were deceived, coerced, or simply erased. Julia sat for hours at the dining table staring at the dossier I had compiled, a composite of Ethan's confession, witness statements, decrypted emails. There were forged birth certificates, medical records for infants marked as deceased, though they were alive in families who had no idea who they were truly raising. When Julia saw a birth certificate with visible signs of tampering, she pressed a trembling hand to her mouth, swallowing a cry. Every child is a life, Daniel. And they stole the truth from hundreds. I nodded, sorrow weighing heavily on me. But what twisted my stomach was a name buried in the list of Horizon's hidden investors, Lawrence Carrington, my father. I couldn't believe my own eyes, yet the internal financial documents, though coded, were undeniable. Large transfers from my family's trust had been funneled into Horizon through a maze of shell funds, the signatures on authorization forms unmistakably his. My father, the man who taught me ethics in business, who told me a man's honor was his greatest asset, had helped build a network of human trafficking. I couldn't understand. I didn't want to believe. But the truth was stark as daylight. Julia saw the tremor in my hands. She laid a quiet hand on my shoulder, grounding me. I know that feeling. When the person you trust most is the one who delivered you into hell. I nodded, staring into nothing. My father had died 2 years ago, taking his secrets with him. But the harm he left behind remained echoing in every stolen infant, every mother like Julia who had been deceived, stripped of her child with cruelty masquerading as fate. I knew I couldn't drag him before a jury, but I could do something else. I could bring every hidden truth into the light. I contacted a seasoned investigative journalist, one who had exposed national medical scandals before. I didn't hand him everything, just enough to show him this wasn't a single case, but a systemic operation involving powerful names. After reading what I gave him, the journalist looked at me for a long time. He asked no questions. He only said one sentence. "When you're ready to release it all, I'll be standing beside you." No hesitation. Julia stood behind me then, nodding. She didn't need to say a word. She understood that this fight was no longer hers alone. It belonged to everyone who had ever been silenced. And we, with every truth we carried, would be the ones to restore those stolen voices, no matter the cost. Julia sat motionless in the wide office of the federal attorney, the light from the tall window cutting across her face and revealing the dark circles beneath her eyes and the dry, cracked edges of her lips, marks left by too many sleepless nights. In front of her sat two FBI agents, a representative from the prosecutor's office, and the attorney she shared with Daniel. Yet in that crowded room, Julia felt profoundly alone. She had known this moment would come, ever since Daniel handed over the entire dossier and the official investigations began, but she had not expected it to feel this heavy, this cold. The female agent, middle-aged, gentle-voiced yet firm, asked her questions one by one, detail by detail, from the first moment Julia realized she was pregnant, to the accident, to waking up in the hospital without her child, and finally to Ethan. Julia recounted everything, leaving nothing out. There was no anger in her voice, only an unvarnished truth that bordered on haunting. She closed her eyes when she described the moment Mason had reached for her in the restaurant, identifying her across a crowded room with an instinct that defied logic. She trembled, remembering the tiny hospital bracelet hidden for 2 years. She cried when she spoke of the nameless grief that had clung to her like a shapeless ghost. Every word she spoke was a crack in the wall that had concealed a sophisticated child trafficking system built by Ethan, Horizon, and powerful men who believed their fortress was impenetrable. But now, she was the one delivering the first strike against that fortress. One agent typed continuously, fingers darting over the keyboard. The other never broke eye contact, and in his gaze was a rare kind of respect, as though he sat before someone who had survived a war few returned from whole. When Julia finished, no one spoke for several minutes. The hum of the air conditioner and the tick of the clock filled the space. Her attorney finally placed his hand on the table, his voice low but steady. "With today's testimony, Julia, you are now an essential witness in a federal investigation involving infant identity fraud, falsified medical documentation, and the trafficking of newborns under the guise of surrogacy. You understand what that means." Julia nodded. "I understand, and I'm ready." She knew there would be no turning back. When she left the federal building that afternoon, the sky was fading into dusk. The wind grew stronger, lifting red gold leaves into the air like a silent storm. Daniel was waiting for her by the car. He didn't ask anything. He simply opened the door and held her hand tightly when she climbed in. He knew every word she had spoken, every silence she had carried, had finally found the place it belonged. She leaned her head on his shoulder, feeling lighter, not because something had ended, but because the truth had, at last, been heard. Not merely heard, believed. She had once been a woman who lost her child, a wife betrayed, a mother erased from her son's life as if she had never existed. Now, she was a witness. The first voice, and perhaps the strongest one, pointed straight at the heart of a justice system long shrouded in shadow, and she would keep speaking for Mason, for every mother like her, and for herself. Truth might not heal every wound, but it was the first step for the survivors to stand again. And she had chosen to stand. The penthouse on the 32nd floor was no longer a temporary refuge. It had begun to feel like home. Julia stepped out of her bedroom in the early morning light, the sunlight pouring through the sheer curtains and casting a soft gold across the entire apartment. The scent of freshly brewed coffee drifted from the kitchen, blending with the sound of a child's laughter coming from the living room. She paused in the hallway, the same hallway that not long ago had felt like a border between her and her son's world. Mason sat on the rug, a toy fire truck in his hand, babbling happily, while Daniel sat beside him, playing the role of the accident victim with comedic seriousness. Julia smiled, a fragile smile that tightened with worry before it could fully bloom. Even with the evidence clear, even with the courts likely to acknowledge her as Mason's biological mother, she knew that in his innocent heart, she was still a stranger. Maternal love didn't come from blood alone. It required time, patience, and a kind of love that asked for nothing in return. She walked into the living room and lowered herself onto the floor a short distance from Mason, close enough for him to sense her presence, but far enough not to intrude. Mason glanced at her, his blue-gray eyes so much like Daniel's, their curiosity shimmering. Julia smiled gently and pointed at the truck. "Who are we rescuing today, sweetheart?" Mason didn't answer at first, but instead of turning away, he quietly pushed the truck toward her, placing it on her knee, a simple invitation. Julia picked it up, her hand trembling, her eyes stinging. "This one's hurt," she said softly, guiding the truck back onto the floor. "We have to get him to the hospital fast." Mason giggled and pushed it back. The game repeated, simple, wordless, and inside her, something unknotted, one thread at a time. A few days later, Mason began seeking her out on his own. Once, he wandered into the kitchen while she was baking. "Does it have chocolate?" he asked, wide-eyed. She touched his hair gently. "It does. But you have to wait 10 more minutes." Mason nodded and plopped onto the floor to wait as if 10 minutes were a lifetime, but one worth enduring. She began reading to him at night, first from a distance, then closer. Until eventually he rested his head against her shoulder before the second story ended. She didn't tell Daniel about every tiny moment, but he noticed the softening in her voice, the increasing brightness in Mason's laughter, the warmth in the penthouse that no interior designer had ever managed to create. One night, after Julia switched off the light in Mason's room, the boy shifted in his bed and whispered a word he had never spoken before. "Mama." She froze. The world stopped. He said it again, soft but clear. "Mama. Stay?" She turned, tears spilling before she could nod. "Yes, sweetheart, I'm here. I'm staying." That single word was not a mistake. It was the final piece of the bridge they had been building. It was the first time he had named her, and he did it with the genuine trust of a child whose heart had finally opened. Julia didn't sleep that night. She stood by her window, watching the city lights shimmer below, her heart lighter than it had ever been. She knew the road ahead would still be long, full of legal battles, suspicious eyes, unhealed wounds. But she had her son beside her, and she finally had a place to begin again. Not from nothing, but from the first true mama spoken with love. Julia sat alone in the living room as the clock neared midnight. The penthouse so quiet she could hear the faint whisper of wind brushing against the high-rise balcony and the gentle rhythm of Mason's breathing from the bedroom next door. The soft yellow glow from the floor lamp cast uneven shadows along the wall, creating the sensation that she was sitting between two worlds. One was the world she knew all too well: pain, loss, betrayal, and darkness. The other was the one she lived in now, filled with light, hope, and Daniel. And that was precisely what frightened her. Since moving into the penthouse, Julia felt herself changing, not just because of Mason, but because of Daniel. He never pushed, never demanded gratitude, repayment, or a label for whatever existed between them. He simply remained, steady and quiet, like a place to lean on that she was too afraid to trust, yet unable to walk away from. He always woke before her, brewing coffee and leaving a folded newspaper beside the sofa she favored. He always said her name at the exact moment she needed someone to remind her she still existed, and he always looked at her with eyes free of judgment and pity, filled only with a rare kind of respect. But that look unsettled her the most. Another man had once looked at her that way, a man she believed would give her love, family, and peace. And then, in a single night, everything was destroyed. Ethan hadn't only taken her child, he had taken her trust in her own heart. Now, every time Daniel came close, every time he gently tucked a stray strand of hair behind her ear or placed a steady hand on her shoulder, intentional by its gentleness, unintentional by its timing, her heart tightened, like he had touched a scar not yet healed. She found herself anticipating those moments, then immediately scolding herself for wanting them. Her heartbeat quickened whenever he looked at her over the rim of his coffee mug, yet she turned away each time, afraid that his tenderness was temporary, and his kindness nothing more than responsibility. One night, after Mason had fallen into a deep sleep and the wind outside howled in sharp, icy bursts, Julia sat beside Daniel in the living room. They kept the lights dim, allowing only the fireplace to illuminate their faces in a warm orange glow. Daniel handed her a cup of tea without saying a word. She accepted it, their hands brushing lightly. A brief moment, but inside her, it spiraled into something much deeper. She knew he wanted to say something, and she had too many questions of her own. But instead of speaking, she stared into the fire and let out a quiet breath that carried a question she wasn't sure was meant for him or herself. If one day I wanted to leave, would you stop me? Daniel was silent for a few seconds, then answered, his voice low and slow. I wouldn't keep you here with anything but the truth. The truth is that I want you to stay. But if staying hurts you, I'd be the first to open the door. Julia looked at him directly for the first time in days. In his eyes, she saw no possessiveness, no pleading, only sincerity so honest it made her feel seen, heard, and allowed to exist as herself. Not as a mother, not as a witness, not as someone stitched into a nightmare that no longer defined her. That night, Julia said nothing more. But when she stood to return to her room, her steps felt lighter. And when she lay down beside Mason, she realized she no longer feared the sound of a knock in the dark. Because if someone did knock, she knew it would be Daniel. And although she wasn't ready to admit it even to herself, that knowledge had begun to mean something deeper than any promise. It had begun to feel like home. The next morning, when Julia woke, something felt different in the air. It wasn't Seattle's light rain, or the fact that Daniel had left early for a board meeting. It was that, for the first time in a long stretch of days, she felt completely ready. No fear of being hurt. No weight of the past pulling her back. No hesitation between staying and walking away. Today, she would do what her heart had whispered for so long but her mind had resisted. She would choose to be a mother. Not on paper, not through legal battles or DNA results, but through presence, through action, through love. Julia stepped into Mason's room. He was still asleep, hair tousled, one cheek flushed from resting on his side. She pulled his blanket higher and pressed a gentle kiss to his forehead. It no longer frightened her the way it once had, when every touch was clouded by insecurity. Now she felt something sacred bloom through her every time she held him. At noon, when Mason returned from preschool, Julia was waiting at the door. For the first time, she knelt down, opened her arms, and said clearly, "Mama's here." Mason ran to her without hesitation, his small arms wrapping around her neck. It was no longer the instinctive response of a child reacting to kindness, it came from a deeper place. Mason had accepted her. But more importantly, Julia had learned to accept herself. For a year she had fought for truth, for justice, for her child. Now the only thing missing was her own decision, one made not from fear or duty, but from desire to live fully as Mason's mother. She sat at the dining table, opened her laptop, and began typing the official request for full legal guardianship. Daniel's attorney had prepared all the documents weeks earlier, waiting only for her signature. Julia rested her fingers on the keyboard, feeling none of the old pressure. She knew this decision would open a new chapter in her life. A chapter where she was no longer a woman living in fear, but a mother living with love. That evening, when Daniel returned, he found Julia in the kitchen trimming flowers, her hair pulled into a loose bun, her shirt simple, her eyes glowing in a way he had never seen before. She looked up and handed him the signed form. "I want to begin a new journey. I used to be afraid. I thought I wasn't strong enough. But now, I know I'm ready." Daniel looked at the paper, then at her. He didn't speak. He simply walked forward and pulled her into his arms. Not for gratitude, not for triumph, but because he knew she had crossed a threshold that no one else could cross for her. Julia held him back this time without distance, without fear. She knew she wasn't perfect, and neither was the world. But in a life filled with blurred lines between right and wrong, love could still be a compass. And from this day on, she chose to follow it. Not to fix the past, but to build a future worthy of Mason, worthy of herself, and worthy of the days ahead, days when she would no longer be just Julia, but simply, and finally, a mother. Winter arrived early in Seattle, but inside Daniel's penthouse everything seemed warmer than it had ever been since the day Julia signed the adoption papers and stepped fully into the role of a mother who no longer needed blood ties to prove her place. Mornings began with Mason's laughter echoing from the kitchen, where Julia tried her best to learn Daniel's pancake recipe. Sometimes burning the edges a little, but always making the boy giggle and insist on eating every bit because Mom makes it better than Dad. Daniel sat reading the newspaper, glancing up at them with eyes that softened more with each passing day. He was no longer the cold, calculating man who made million-dollar decisions without blinking, but someone who could stand quietly in a doorway just to watch Julia tuck a strand of hair behind her ear while washing dishes. Julia, too, was no longer the woman who had first walked into this home with a heart full of cracks. Now she moved through the apartment as if every corner already belonged to her, the place where Mason's photos stood, where children's books piled up, where Mason's tiny coats hung beside Daniel's jackets, as if they had always belonged together without needing a ceremony to declare it. One night after Mason fell asleep, Julia brought a box of old photos into the living room, ultrasound images, worn hospital folders forgotten 2 years ago. She sat beside Daniel and, for the first time, allowed him to see the memories she had once guarded so tightly. As he turned each picture over in his hands, his eyes never left her face. There were questions he had never asked, not because he didn't want to know, but because he had been waiting for the moment she was ready to tell him herself. She pointed at one ultrasound photo and smiled faintly. "Back then, I thought I would raise the baby alone, live in a tiny rented apartment, work while studying, just trying to survive. I never imagined life would bend in such a strange circle." Daniel set the photo down and took her hand firmly. "You're not walking alone anymore." Julia looked at him without speaking, but the way her fingers tightened around his said everything. In the days that followed, nothing changed dramatically. There were no grand confessions, no dramatic romantic gestures, just the slow accumulation of small habits walking Mason to preschool together, sharing dinner and talking about the little things, watching cartoons until they fell asleep on the sofa. Once, during a heavy rainstorm, the three of them gathered around the fireplace, Mason curled into Julia's lap, and Daniel's arm resting gently around her shoulders. The moment was so peaceful that Julia suddenly realized this might be what family felt like. Not a title, not a definition, simply presence, simply being there for one another. Julia began opening up to Daniel more, sharing her dreams returning to college, maybe working with an organization that helped single mothers. Daniel not only listened but helped her reach out to resources, even offering to establish a support fund. But what truly moved Julia was not his wealth, it was the way he let her lead the journey of finding herself again. One night, after tucking Mason into bed, Julia stepped onto the balcony to watch the city. Daniel came up behind her and wrapped an arm lightly around her waist. This time, she didn't step away. She leaned into him as naturally as if she had been doing it her whole life. He spoke quietly, his voice steady. "I never thought I'd have a family like this." Julia smiled and rested her hand over his where it lay against her stomach. "Neither did I. But maybe the most miraculous things are the ones that never fit in any plan." Daniel placed a soft kiss on her hair, and for the first time since everything began, there was nothing left that needed saying. They had walked through pain, through darkness, and had reached a kind of happiness that wasn't perfect, but enough to let them know they belonged to one another. Without a grand moment, without a single declaration, Julia and Daniel were no longer two people walking side by side. They were a family. And Mason, with his bright morning laughter, was the most beautiful proof of it. One quiet weekend morning, soft sunlight streamed through the penthouse windows, warming the wooden floors and carrying the scent of fresh coffee and waffles that Julia had just pulled from the oven. Daniel was struggling to assemble a small fabric tent for Mason in the living room, while the little boy spun circles around him, eyes sparkling with excitement as if it were the very first house he had ever owned. Julia watched them from the kitchen, her heart swelling with a feeling she once believed she would never know again: peace and belonging. It was strange to think she had lost everything, only to find more than she ever thought possible. Not because life had become perfect, but because she had learned to embrace the imperfections as part of her journey. Mason was not the child who grew under her heart during 9 months of waiting. But he was the child who came to her through pain, forging a bond she knew nothing could break. Daniel was not the first man she had loved, but he was the only one who had stood patiently at the edge of her fear and doubt, waiting for her to open her heart without ever pushing. And that made him the only one worthy of her trust, the only one she could call family. Life after the storm never returns to what it used to be. But Julia learned that the most precious thing wasn't preserving every piece of the past. It was the ability to begin again, from whatever remained, with a heart covered in scars but still beating for love. They didn't live in a fairy tale. There were nights when Mason was sick, and they took turns staying up. There were disagreements about parenting, arguments over things that seemed trivial. But what makes a family isn't the absence of conflict. It's the choice to sit down afterward, listen, and continue forward together. Julia understood that sometimes the miracle doesn't appear in fireworks or romantic confessions, but in the way a child calls her mom every morning, in the hand of the man who rests gently on her shoulder when she's anxious, and in the quiet dinners cooked with love and forgiveness. Their story didn't have a clear ending. They were writing it day by day, through real life, through missteps and healing, through love expressed in the smallest actions. And perhaps the most beautiful thing about their story is how much it mirrors our own lives. None of us are perfect. All of us have been hurt. But every one of us deserves a place to return to, a home that doesn't have to be big or luxurious, only a home where people choose to hold on to one another through storms and sunlight alike. And what about you? After hearing this story, do you see yourself in Julia's struggles, her choices, her quiet strength? Have you ever stood at the threshold of trust and wondered if you were strong enough to take that next step? Share your thoughts in the comments below. We truly want to hear from the hearts of those who walk this journey with us. If this story touched you, don't forget to subscribe, like, and share so we can bring more honest, emotional, deeply human stories to others. We upload meaningful narratives every day, and we hope you'll continue to journey with us through many more lives and lessons ahead. Wishing you good health, peace, happiness, and the strength to find your own light, even when the world grows dark. Thank you for watching, and we'll see you in the next video.